Welcome to the Sanctions Age, the podcast that explores how sanctions are changing the world. My name is Isfandir Batmanghelidj. Today's show examines what it's like reporting from inside a country facing stringent sanctions. Foreign correspondents based in sanctioned countries aren't just reporting on economic disruptions, they're experiencing them firsthand, contending with volatile markets, rising prices, product shortages, and a darkening mood. My guest today spent 7 years reporting on the highs and lows of the Iranian economy. Golnar Motevalli is a reporter for Bloomberg. Between 2013 and 2020, she was a correspondent based in Tehran. Today, Golnar leads Bloomberg's coverage on Iran from London. Golnar, thanks for coming onto the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So I want to go back in time to when you first arrived in Tehran. It was an optimistic moment. Maybe we're starting to come back into a little bit of a moment of optimism. For the listeners, we're recording this basically a day after President Trump announced that there would be negotiations between Iran and the U.S. later this week. But in 2013, a deal was not in place yet, and the Iranian economy was still reeling from major sanctions imposed in the previous year, including an embargo on oil exports. And at the same time, there was some optimism that better days could be ahead. Iran was negotiating an interim nuclear deal with the world powers, and you arrived in Tehran in the middle of all of this. So what motivated your decision to locate there, and what was the significance of that timing?
I had sort of ambitions and dreams to one day be a reporter based in Tehran for a long time, for many years. I think it was one of the things that actually drove me towards journalism, and from quite a young age. And back then it was based on this feeling that the image of Iran that I was watching on TV, on these 2 or 3 minute news packages on the news with my parents, was not the same country that I was visiting as a child during my summer holidays. Now having lived there, and as I've grown older, you can't compare like a few weeks of a summer holiday where you're kind of like wrapped in the warmth of like your family and kind of like those rose-tinted childhood memories with the reality of actually living in the country. But yeah, that was what kind of drove me towards my job, my career. And it took me a while. I'd already been working for about 10 years before I'd actually located to Tehran. And I think I had this feeling that it's either now or never. If I want to be out in the field again, reporting, I want it to be from Iran. If I don't try now, I'll probably never bother again. And so, yeah, I decided in May 2013 to relocate to Iran, and I was lucky to have a job offer at the time. Everything depended on getting press accreditation from the Iranian government, which is one of the complexities of working in Iran as a journalist, is if you don't have accreditation, you're effectively, I guess, breaking the law if you're reporting from there. And that's not to say that people haven't done that or they don't do that, and some people do that quite successfully.
So obviously getting press accreditation is very important. I mean, it seems to me that probably Iran was inclined to have more foreign journalists be based there in this period while they were trying to break out of their isolation. Do you think that was a factor in their decision to allow you and perhaps other colleagues for other news organizations to basically base themselves in Tehran?
I don't know. It's really hard to make sort of definitive statements about decision-making in the government or in the sort of elite echelon. I think what you can safely say is that when there's a change of administration, there's often a change of atmosphere and mood music, depending on what's going on in the background geopolitically. So at that time, Ahmadinejad's presidency was coming to a definite end because he'd already ran for 2 consecutive terms. So everyone knew he was going to be replaced. And there was definitely this sense that people were just tired of sanctions. They were getting tired of inflation and the fact that the currency had declined so dramatically, and that something needed to be done. And there was little doubt, I think, in the atmosphere that the next person who was going to be elected was going to be the antidote to Ahmadinejad, who would try to kind of unpick some of the hostility that he may have developed or did develop over his 2 terms, not just in terms of his relationship with the rest of the world, I should specifically say with the Western world and the Northern Hemisphere, but the damage that had been done internally and domestically to civil society and to freedom of expression and people's sense of political enfranchisement as well. That was a very serious issue, I think, at the time. So there was a definite sense that the next person that was going to come in had to be someone that was looking for sanctions removal, that was looking for some form of détente with the West. And the refrain that I remember hearing quite often back then in 2013, this is about 6 weeks before that election, the election that brought in Hassan Rouhani's government, was, it can't get any worse than this, can it? And that, looking back on that, is quite interesting because, boy, did it get worse, and in ways that I don't think anyone at that time would have imagined.
So we'll get to why things got worse, but I'm interested a little bit in kind of whether or not you were daunted at all by kind of stepping into Iran at this moment. So, you've just described that actually this was a long-held ambition and something that you'd kind of been working your way towards for over 10 years. During those 10 years, you spent a couple years actually reporting from Afghanistan, not an easy place to be a journalist. And obviously that would have given you this really strong background in political and security issues. But reporting for Bloomberg and also reporting in Iran at this moment, the economic issues would have been much more sort of central, particularly given the need to understand how sanctions were impacting the economy. So I'm curious a little bit about how you got to grips with becoming not just a reporter covering Iran, but also a reporter covering Iran's economy, and really how long maybe it took to feel that you had a good sense of what was happening in the Iranian economy.
So I guess there are 2 separate things. One is my decision to go out there and just being very aware of the any potential kind of pitfalls or flags or anything that I should be aware of as a dual national, British, Iranian, as someone who had previously worked for organisations like the BBC and Reuters, both kind of like persona non grata news organisations when I went into the country. And any consequences it might have in terms of concerns that my family might have for my safety. It's one thing for me to kind of be okay with the stress of, is it okay for me to go into Iran? But it's another thing for me to project that onto my family, so in many ways it was kind of quite a selfish decision. At the same time, I didn't feel like there was any reason why I shouldn't go. I had been to Iran very recently. I'd traveled to Iran while I was as a journalist before, not working as a journalist, as a private citizen, but someone whose job happened to be journalism. So that was one piece. And I guess I just kind of had to, I just tried to be as formal and open and direct as I could be. So, one of the first things I did was go to the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance Foreign Ministry unit as soon as I had the chance to, with my letters of accreditation and all my credentials. I was very transparent. I didn't work before I got that accreditation. I made sure that I wasn't filing or anything like that. And my family were, luckily for me, very, very supportive. And I think they really, at that time in 2013, I think they were excited about the fact that there would be more coverage of Iran. Mm-hmm. The other side of it, that bit intimidated me much more, I think, was getting my head around how sanctions actually work. Because from a distance, you get this impression that, oh my God, you probably can't get vegetables, or there's a scarcity of everything, When you're there, you don't see that, on the surface. Shops are open, traffic is, mashallah, thriving in Tehran as usual. And, it's a bustling, massive megalopolis of a city, and there's construction work happening all the time. So yeah, it's difficult initially to get your head around the impact that sanctions have. But I think one way, actually, for people that haven't been to Iran or Russia or Cuba or Venezuela, or don't have that kind of experience, if you just look at the UK, interestingly, I personally think that not just the UK, maybe elsewhere, but two things that may give people a sense of what it's like are COVID, the pandemic and the lockdown, and more specifically Brexit.
Sure.
Because similarly, in a weird kind of inverse way, Brexit was Britain's decision to leave a kind of multilateral construct, I guess, a kind of globalist idea of free trade between borders. And the Iran nuclear deal was Iran's push to opt into a multilateral agreement with the US and with world powers to have restrictions on its trade lifted, right? So in a way, sometimes I think Brexit is, I wouldn't say this, but I do remember at the time reading op-eds in the Iranian press that made me, that often refer to this idea of, part of Iran's problem, and the problem that the Iranian economy suffers from is this idea of self-sanctioning. It's not just sanctions that are imposed on you, it's stuff that you do internally that that compounds the problem, stuff that you don't need to do, obstacles that you put in the way of your own economy that make it harder, regardless of whether sanctions are in place or not. And there was a lot of talk about, stuff that Iran does that it doesn't need to do that makes its own life more difficult, that kind of had parallels with some of the things I was reading in the British press around 2016 around Brexit and the implications it might have for the British economy, which, and I think, you can sense that, we're in the middle of Coal Drops Yard, which is like a kind of massive symbol of like, in a city regeneration, huge amounts of money have been spent here. There are new shops that are open here, brands that I've never seen in my life, selling all sorts of stuff. Restaurants look apparently on the surface to be thriving, but there's actually a real cost of living crisis in this country that is very acute and is pretty severe. Like, I've been around not that long, but I've been around, long enough to remember my parents moaning about, I don't know, Thatcher or whatever. And it's pretty bad at the moment. And I think that gives you a sense of what it's like. So you get into Iran and you go to Tehran and you're like, well, there are all these Adidas like franchises and, someone's just opened a burger restaurant. Well, yeah, that happens. But at the same time, people are living with runaway inflation. Maybe there are plans that they've cancelled. Maybe, the parent who was going to send their child to a certain school or was saving up to do X, Y, and Z for their child's future, they've just seen that kind of just go, just completely disappear in the space of a week, because now all the money that they saved isn't worth anything anymore.
So I think we'll get back to this perspective, which I think is really important, about trying to disentangle between the things that are caused by the sanctions, the things that are caused by domestic policies. the fact that you can have a country that maybe is economically stagnant for 10 years, whether it's the UK or Iran, but when you're in that country, you can still find clear evidence of a lot of wealth and a lot of prosperity that's still being generated if it's not being shared among a wide group of people. But before we get there, I want to go back to this kind of concern you had about sort of presenting yourself in Iran and getting the access that you would need in order to be a journalist successfully in the country. I mean, it would seem that eventually you were able to present your credentials and win trust in different institutions so that as a journalist you could put your questions to serious stakeholders. And one example came in November of 2015. So the nuclear deal at that point had been agreed. It was agreed in the summer of that year, but it had not been fully implemented, and everyone was sort of waiting for the moment when the sanctions would actually be lifted. And you secured an exclusive interview with Iran's oil minister, Bijan Zanganeh, probably the most important minister in the country, given that Iran's economy largely runs on oil exports. And what's interesting is that Zanganeh spoke to you in English in an interview that was filmed, and so it could be broadcast by Bloomberg on its TV channel, in addition to being packaged in other ways. And I'm curious to know, what was the process like in order to secure an interview from an Iranian minister? And obviously, it would seem that at this moment, the media was also being used as a platform for stakeholders from Iran and also from the West to send messages to one another. So what do you think the message was that Zanganeh was trying to send at that moment in that conversation with you?
The interesting thing about Zanganeh is that he's very experienced. And I think it was at least his third time in office.
Mm-hmm.
He'd been oil minister before, and he'd been power minister, I believe, before then. So he had a lot of experience and oversight over the shape and state of both Iran's oil industry, but its wider energy infrastructure. And obviously he had prior OPEC experience. One of the most important things, I think, during his tenure was that he was a known entity to not just OPEC bureaucrats, but other OPEC ministers who at that time would have remembered him from previous Iranian administrations. I believe Naimi, who was the Saudi oil minister at the time, he'd also been around for a long time. They, if I'm not mistaken, they knew each other from before. And he also had really, really good advisors. And because of that experience, I think he understood the importance of speaking to the market. So when he was giving interviews, or when, if he agreed to an interview with me as a Bloomberg journalist, I think it was much more to do with the fact that he, at the time, and this is my own speculation, obviously, this is my own views on this, it's because he understood the significance of speaking to the market as Iran's new, quote unquote new, because he would have been in the job for about a year and a half, 2 years at that point, oil minister. And I think he understood the significance of that, because that wasn't the first. That was the first of several interviews he then gave to us, and he clearly at the time had a sense that he knew what to say. Mm-hmm. He is a man, I guess, still of few words in that situation, but I think he used his words very carefully. And I think that's very, very significant. So
we've been building up to this, but obviously a few months after that interview in January 2016, the nuclear deal was actually implemented, meaning that the sanctions that had been kind of preventing Iran's economy from growing for several years were lifted. And that month, you wrote a story with the headline, Iran sees $50 billion in foreign investment driving post-sanctions boom. So suddenly you were in the middle of a very different story than when you arrived. And when you had arrived in Iran, the country was still reeling economically. There was no clarity on whether the nuclear negotiations would really work. And within a few years, we're envisioning $50 billion of foreign investment flowing into the country. What was it like reporting on Iran at that moment, and how did your kind of task as a journalist sort of change when suddenly it looked like the economic winds were shifting?
So I think one of the biggest changes in my day-to-day work or developments was a kind of increase in press conferences and just events put on for journalists that involved foreign companies or were somehow related to business or an economic policy related to sanctions. And there were quite a few of them. These included things like a visit from, I wish I had kind of taken a close look, but if memory serves me correctly, I'm pretty sure the CEO of Citroën Peugeot PSA was there. And also, I think that followed another visit from Renault. They were both very active in Iran before the sanctions and they wanted to come back. Obviously, Total turned up and signed this big agreement with Sinopec as well and the Iranian oil ministry. That was for development of the South Pars giant gas field.
Suggesting that your interview with Zanganeh was a success. He successfully drew in the foreign investors.
He did. Although, Zanganeh's thing, which I should have said in my previous answer, was that he had this, and this isn't, I think, reform or moderate politicians in Iran, even ones that are quite technocratic like Zanganeh, his whole kind of emphasis was on Europeans coming into Iran. And I even think, I don't know if it was him, but I do remember officials of the oil ministry making quite explicit references to the point where I thought, not sure I would say that, but they were very open about it, saying things like, we don't want Chinese expertise anymore.
Yeah.
We want European expertise. Which if in their context, it doesn't really raise any eyebrows, but maybe, in the end, Iran has, whether it likes it or not, it's had to rely a lot on Chinese trade, its trade relationship with China in quite significant ways. But his emphasis, and just the oil ministry at the time, the big emphasis was on European expertise. And one of the reasons for that is because they had previously agreements with Total before the screws were really turned on the sanctions under Barack Obama and previously under Bill Clinton. So, and they even had quite advanced talks with, I think it was ConocoPhillips.
Yes,
in the
under
90s.
Clinton in the 90s. Yeah.
And apparently, reportedly, Bill Clinton himself kind of intervened and was like, no, thank you.
Yeah.
And Zanganeh, actually, interesting anecdote, Zanganeh was, I believe, minister at the time. And he had and I remember he actually mentioned this, I think, in a couple of scrums with reporters about, we've been here before. Or if he hadn't, I think one of his advisors may have mentioned it in an interview, making an explicit reference to the ConocoPhillips deal. And on Zanganeh's first OPEC meeting, after returning to government, after Hassan Rouhani was elected, the Iranian delegation was staying at this big hotel in Vienna, and it just so happened that Bill Clinton walked in the same day. I think it was the same day that they checked in, because I remember all the journalists were in the lobby just waiting for like an Iranian official to come out that they could sort of doorstep. And then suddenly Bill Clinton sort of walks in, waves at everyone, and it turns out then I found out that his room was directly above the room of the Iranian delegation, which I thought was what the chart, I thought that was a bit, but I guess, all the rooms are sort of like in,
Sure.
Design wise, it's probably not that weird at all.
Probably just a
if you want the
coincidence.
big suite, I mean, really high up, But yeah, it was a coincidence. But I thought, how interesting. Imagine if those two, they wouldn't have bumped into each other in the lift because they're surrounded by security. But I just thought, gosh, isn't that interesting? Like, it's just this kind of like reminder of how circular
a
history
metaphor,
can be. Yeah, exactly.
When you're writing about this 50 billion in foreign direct investment, there was this real expectation that European companies would come in and help, get Iran's economy back on track.
So that was one of the manifestations, was that there was, and then we'd have another press conference about how Daimler wants to come in, Mercedes-Benz, they're going to invest money in all these trucks. And then obviously we had the big sort of like landing of the Airbus.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was the Airbus.
I think it was an A.
Was it A380?
No, not an A380. A340 or something.
Right. It was like
like a mid-sized Airbus.
Yeah. And it kind of came into this air hangar, and it was all very kind of like, wow, and all the Airbus executives were there. I remember interviewing Abbas Araghchi, who was deputy foreign minister at the time. He's now obviously foreign minister, and. Yeah, press conferences about we've ordered all these Boeing Max.
Yeah.
What are they? The Boeing...
Yeah, 737
Max.
Good thing they didn't end up with them.
Yeah, with hindsight, maybe it wasn't such a bad thing that they didn't take that delivery. I don't know, but obviously not great for Boeing. Massive order, huge order for Boeing. I think it was in the tens, the number of jets they had ordered, All of this was going on. And so there was a lot of work to do. There was a lot of activity.
It didn't come to pass. So even by the time that the Airbus plane was being delivered, we were in a very different situation because, we're talking about this exciting moment in January of 2016. Trump was elected in November of 2016, and he had promised to tear up the nuclear deal. And so very quickly, the mood started to shift. And in November of 2016, Bloomberg ran a story titled "Deal Maker or Deal Shredder, Billions Ride on Trump-Iran Policy." And over the course of the subsequent year, it became clear that Trump is more of a deal shredder than a deal maker, and the nuclear deal was indeed torn up by the U.S. And I guess what I'm curious to know is, what was it like to be in Tehran when suddenly reality started to set in that, the Boeings weren't going to show up, the French automakers weren't going to return, the Total oil deal wasn't going to proceed, and that actually this $50 billion target of foreign investment wasn't going to be realized. And of course, this would, filter down and affect people at a much more day-to-day level.
I think the mood was pretty low, I have to say. One of the things is as well, when you're working for a journalist, working as a journalist in Iran, particularly if you're working, I think, for like a Western media organization, people seem to think, you've got because you're covering it every day, they're like, they'll always ask you questions like, what's going to happen? What are you hearing? And you're like, I don't know. I'm not, there's this sense, I think it's maybe the same here, that because you're kind of covering these developments on a day-to-day basis, you might, hear things from a press conference, or you've interviewed someone, you're slightly closer to the situation than a lot of ordinary people who might not, work in that sector may be. But the reality is that you're not, you're following things, especially in Iran, you're following things via what the state news agencies are printing. But generally, I think people were pretty down and frustrated. And I think that, I think it was quite clear that the leadership was pretty... I remember, there were a couple of, Rouhani was very good at making very frequent appearances, either in cabinet meetings or on state TV, and speaking. He had a very kind of strong oratory, and I think he liked making use of that. But I think you could tell through the way that he spoke and the change in his tone that there were points where I think he was getting increasingly frustrated. And I think in that he made an appearance after Trump announced that he was abrogating the nuclear deal and he was basically abandoning it unilaterally. Rouhani, I remember he came onto state TV to make a special kind of public announcement about it, and he seemed visibly, I remember thinking, the guy looks really, he seems very angry over this. Because I think not just him, but his administration, they had tied so much of their own legacy into this one achievement. And they felt that it was basically being thrown in the bin. And it didn't just have implications for them in terms of, the global stage, but it actually had quite meaningful and bad implications for them in many ways domestically at home.
So the economic situation started to worsen as well again. And I mean, another couple headlines that you wrote from stories that you wrote around the time: Iran's policy to stem currency decline backfires and hopes fade in Iran as U.S. sanctions bite. I mean, you weren't just reporting these stories, you were actually in Tehran, living day to day at the time. How did you start to see that economic dysfunction kind of return to Iran as the big political sort of changes took place?
There was quite a bit of panic, I think. I remember that story about Iran's currency policy backfiring very well, because it just, it happened in quite clear phases, and that happened. I think that happened in April. So it actually happened before Trump made his announcement. And this is another thing I remember. The currency's decline started, I think, at least 6 months before Trump actually officially pulled out of the nuclear deal, because everyone was just sensing it was on its way. And if you remember, one of the terms of the JCPOA was that the US every 40 days, I think it was, or 90 days, had to kind of agree to
recertify the deal.
Yes, exactly. Recertify the deal and the waivers, I think, for the countries that were still allowed to buy oil from Iran. And every time there was a sense of, is he going to do it? Is he not going to do it? So already Trump's entry into the White House had kind of like elevated a sense of risk and jeopardy over the nuclear deal before he'd even done anything material. And then the currency, the rial, began to decline quite significantly on that basis alone. And it was quite obviously affecting people. Friends and family would say that they needed to, they had some kind of project related to work that they'd budgeted on, the rial being X amount of, the dollar being X amount of rials. Now that it's kind of like much more expensive, they don't know if they can afford to do it. There was a lot of that. There was this sense, basically, I think people felt that they wouldn't know from one day to the next whether they could go ahead with this plan they had. And not even just like a big plan. It didn't have to be like something quite very kind of middle class and something that someone who's quite well off in Iran might do, like, am I going to be able to go on that kind of holiday to the Maldives this year? Or can I send my children to university in California? It could be something much more mundane than that.
Can I buy that refrigerator that I need to buy that might replace the one that's, breaking down?
Or can I buy the spark plugs I need for my car?
Yeah.
Can I even source them at the moment? Where am I going to find the medicine I need for my MS that was abundant, and now, I can't even get the generic? And then it was quite clear that the government could see this panic Because what happens, and this is obviously not unique to Iran, but people start buying things that they think are going to retain value, whether that could be obviously gold is the kind of classic example. And in Iran, the US dollar is kind of like a sort of
Safe haven.
safe haven, yeah. And so there was obviously a run on US dollar supplies on the unregulated open market. And at that point, the government decided to step in and try to control what was going on and defend the rial. And I think past experience shows you that when you do that with a market, it will just kind of pop up somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what happened. So they attempted to control all the traders on the open, unregulated market because Iran has a parallel exchange rate system and has had for some time. And, they were threatening traders with arrest, telling them you have to shut down shop, no more trade, thinking that was going to freeze the price. Obviously, what happened was, a kind of another parallel black market trade just kind of popped up on the sidelines. So if the, foreign exchange shop was closed on the street, there was someone, if you go down that back alley over there, who's still selling something. So it didn't actually do anything. If anything, it actually backfired and the currency began to depreciate. When the government tried to fix the price, it didn't work.
And it becomes a kind of vicious cycle because I guess this economic instability continues to feed uncertainty.
Yeah.
And you talked about earlier how, people would ask you questions about what's going to happen, thinking that maybe you'd have some unique insight as a journalist. That takes me to this other question, which is really about the role of economic journalism in Iran more broadly. In addition to foreign journalists like yourself, of course, there is a large and very active core of Iranian journalists who are writing for digital and print publications across the country. And there's this question about, well, what is the service of journalism in a country like Iran at a moment like this? And, what does journalism provide for people dealing with these kinds of disruptions? I mean, to what extent do you think that at this moment, ordinary Iranians were turning to reporting from Iranian outlets or foreign outlets to try and understand what was happening in the country and how to deal with this uncertainty?
I actually think most Iranians are pretty financially literate on the whole because they kind of have to be because of the way that the nature of the economy there. And the journalists who work for domestic media, they're amazing. Like, I'm in complete awe of most of them. And I was while I was there because they work extremely hard under really tough circumstances. And they're very passionate about what they do. I think it's a tricky question because Iran's media is so heavily controlled and monopolized by the state. And the independent newspapers that do exist, they still rely on state funding to an extent. So they can't be truly independent, but editorially they try to be. If they try to be too independent, they're immediately at risk of getting shut down, which happens or used to happen very often. Doesn't happen very much at all because there aren't many left to shut down. And so, I have a lot of respect for a lot of the journalists who cover all beats in Iran, because the ones that I've come across are very passionate about what they do. And also, they're paid very little. I mean, salaries in Iran are very low compared to here. We've just had this long conversation about how weak the currency is. But I think journalism is one of those jobs in Iran where, it's you have to love it and be very passionate about it. And most journalists in Iran, I felt were like that. But budding writers, a lot of them as well, just passionate about literature, and or just they just love the job.
And I guess they are doing this really challenging thing, which is trying to provide this public service, which is to do this reporting, to try and push where they can for access to information and to explain to the Iranian public what's happening. But then they're also in this very precarious position because these are jobs that are underpaid and undervalued, and the cost of living crisis is getting worse. And there's this additional question of potential kind of political pressure around this kind of reporting. So you can imagine that for a country like Iran that is being targeted by sanctions, and at this point the Trump administration had really reimposed the sanctions and was trying to crush the Iranian economy, reporting about the reality of what's happening in the Iranian economy could be a little bit sensitive because it could be seen by those outside as a way of kind of tracking their progress in the sanctions. So did you find in this period that it became more difficult to report on what was happening? Did the economy become more opaque in ways that made economic journalism challenging?
I remember when I first arrived in 2013, for whatever reason, I had this sense that I don't know where I got this from, that it was a bad idea to say that the sanctions were damaging Iran. It was kind of like, officially in the state media, it wasn't the line you take. The line you take is like, look, we're thriving. It's fine. We can deal with it.
They're adapting, resisting.
Yeah, and they're not a big deal. That did change. And I do remember there was a shift, and I can't remember when it happened, but there was this shift in how unjust and cruel they were in the official language and rhetoric. And this idea that sanctions were really affecting the livelihoods of ordinary Iranians, and they were unjust and they were unfair, and they were, causing people to slide into poverty and stuff like that. So that the narrative did become much more about, look at how the West is bullying Iran, how the West's economic reach is trying to subjugate the society and disturb and manipulate the population.
And maybe especially under Trump, given that the US had taken this kind of unilateral move. And then, of course, there was the pandemic in this period. And so I think I see what you're saying, which is that the Iranians, from the official standpoint, leaned into the line that there were these humanitarian costs that were unfair.
Definitely, definitely. This was an issue about the Trump administration not caring about Iranians on a human level at all. There was definitely that sense from the rhetoric from Iranian officials.
So then it becomes challenging because it goes back to the point that you raised earlier about Iranians being financially literate and understanding the economy because they have to. One of the real through lines in your reporting is that while you were speaking to business leaders and government officials to get the picture of, what their views on the Iranian economy, you consistently in your reporting also spoke to ordinary people to get a sense of what their experiences were. Why was that something that was a feature of your reporting? And what do you think that having those conversations provided you, and in turn your readers who are reading these reports on Bloomberg, what did it provide them in terms of perspective about what's happening in the economy, what is sanctions, and what's maybe factors other than sanctions?
I felt, as someone who was reading a lot about Iran before going to Iran and working there as a journalist, I felt that the way it was being treated by and large felt quite sort of dry and abstract. It was very much focused on nuclear talks. Iranian delegation are going to Almaty to meet, I don't know, the European delegation, or the EU is doing, it was kind of very, and it's still like, I write a lot of stories like that and have written a lot of stories like that over the past few years. And you can't, now when I think about the way that I judged those stories, I didn't realize, you're writing a story about something that's quite diplomatic, quite kind of technical in many ways. But I guess I also felt that what was being lost was this sense that there's this whole kind of population of people caught in the middle of this standoff. And when I say standoff, I mean diplomatic standoff over the nuclear program, who are just trying to get by and live their lives. And so I've always felt that it's important to kind of, if you're there, you're in Tehran, you need to make use of it. Otherwise you could just be anywhere monitoring Iranian news outlets. The thing that you can do if you're there, if you've got accreditation, no one's going to stop you, is go out and speak to people in the street, ordinary Iranians, ask them how they're living, what life is like. So I tried to reflect that in my stories as much as I could. It's not always easy. A lot of the time, it's very hard to get people to speak to you, especially on the record.
Do you think that the editorial approach to Iran has changed significantly from, let's say, 2013? I mean, we started this conversation talking about this idea that you wanted to go out there and maybe take a slightly different approach, be able to report on the ground and bring these voices into the conversation. Is that something that, I suspect it's become harder because actually there are fewer Iranian foreign journalists based in Tehran today. But generally speaking, do you think there is more consideration among editors about getting this fuller picture of Iran?
I don't know. That's a really hard question to answer. I'm pretty sure there are fewer foreign journalists now in Tehran than when I was there, accredited ones. Yeah. I might be wrong. I don't know. That's a guess.
That's my assumption, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm basing that on just mentally trying to figure out who left and wasn't replaced.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And based on that, I don't think there are as many. And I can't really, there's, when generally relationships between countries deteriorate, I guess one of the kind of consequences are that maybe you'll find fewer journalists from, in this case, I guess Iran's relationship with the West deteriorated significantly after Donald Trump became president. We can't, there was a drone, he ordered a drone strike on Qasem Soleimani, and he pretty much tried to effectively ban or embargo Iranian oil exports. These aren't small things, and in that kind of situation, should we be surprised that there are fewer journalists there working for US news organizations? No, probably not. I think it's probably predictable. And I think the same happens probably on the other side as well. I think it's probably very difficult if you're an Iranian national to get a visa to work in the US now.
Or study, or
or
really
study,
anything, or just visit.
or just visit.
Yeah.
You know, I think these things come hand in hand, and I think that's quite normal when relations between countries deteriorate or collapse at the same time. There's a lot that the countries can do themselves domestically in terms of, you know, how they take care of their own citizens at times of when they're pressure or when they're under pressure, or where there's a fear of conflict or anything, that can also, you know, do a lot and can say a lot about a country.
Well, I mean, we have to hope that maybe there's a more optimistic kind of period for Iran's relations with the West on the way. But I do want to end by reflecting on actually one of the first stories you wrote from Iran. And you published this story in May 2013, the same month you moved to Tehran. And the title of the report was "Iran's Brain Drain is the West's Gain." And the story was about how young Iranians who were facing a lot of economic pressure and a lot of social strictures were deciding to leave Iran. And 7 years later, you too decided to leave Tehran. What were the factors that led to that decision? And I mean, is it too much to say that that first article kind of foreshadowed how your time and experience in Iran was going to turn out?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't, I wouldn't presume to put myself in, that category of the Iranian brain drain, just because,
Sure,
I'm just very kind of sort of aware, and I guess alive to the fact that I can't compare myself to someone who was born,
of course,
and raised and educated and spent their whole lives in the Islamic Republic.
It wasn't as fraught a decision for you to
No,
leave.
not at all.
Yeah.
Some people would say I was in a position of privilege because I, as a British dual Iranian national, was able to use my British passport and come back to the UK,
Of
and
course.
at some point, and to Europe or wherever. And that's very difficult for a lot of Iranians to do, because sadly their passports aren't seen as very valuable by the rest of the world, and there are very few countries where they can go, where they don't need a visa beforehand, and it's very hard to get those visas in most cases. But I don't think, also the brain drain isn't anything new for Iran either. And it's not a problem that just affects Iran, but I think you can see, if you compare Iran to its peers in the region, economic peers, countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, maybe it's, I think the experience that Iranians have had over the past few decades has been very different. I don't know what the brain drain situation is like in those countries.
Well, let me maybe put the question a little differently. I mean, was it conceivable, had the situation with Iran, the nuclear deal, the politics, the economics, I mean, there are a lot of ifs here, but was it conceivable that you could have continued to live in Tehran and report from there? And was it the case that the change in circumstances for the country was a factor in your decision, the way it might be for many young Iranians who certainly have to work much harder to give themselves the chance to try and build a life elsewhere?
Yeah, possibly, because my press accreditation was not renewed after July 2019, I believe. I just didn't get my press card again, and I was told that I wouldn't get it. And I think we tried to appeal, and it just, it was quite clear that they were not going to renew my press accreditation, and there wasn't much, I could, resign from my job and continue living in Iran. I was told, you're an Iranian national, you're a citizen, you have every right to be here, you just can't work as a journalist. So I had to make a really, really tough decision. So in that respect, yeah, I guess you're right. I guess a lot of people were making a lot of tough decisions, and maybe not so tough for a lot of people, because it's exhausting, I think, living in, and it's not just about sanctions as well. It's a lot of this is about living in a country where you might be frustrated about a lot of the way a lot of things function. And I think I've listened to a lot of really heartbreaking stories. And, the worst and most heartbreaking story I had to listen to was from the mother of one of the Iranians, one of the more than 100 Iranians who was aboard the Ukraine International Airlines flight that was shot down by the IRGC, who said that they mistook it for a cruise missile, mistook that flight for a cruise missile. And what was heartbreaking about that was that her son had emigrated to Canada, because after the sanctions, after Rouhani was elected, the family were quite hopeful maybe that the situation would improve in Iran. And I think her son stuck around, but found it quite hard. He was an engineer, to kind of get a decent job, because I think he felt that there was a lot of nepotism involved, and he didn't know the right people in the right places. It was much more about that than it was about his skills. And she said eventually he was just frustrated, and he sold his little Peugeot 206, which is like, every teenager's car in Iran.
Yeah.
The first car is often something like that. And he emigrated to Canada and joined his sister. And, on one trip visiting his parents, he and his sister and their respective partners were all part of the brain drain, I guess. And, on a trip back from Tehran visiting their parents, they were killed, and to me at the time when that happened, it kind of crystallized the fate of Iran's middle class. There was something extraordinarily kind of symbolic and deeply, deeply scarring and painful about that experience. And in a sense, I think that kind of changed society, maybe. There was kind of a shift, I think, after that.
We haven't talked so much about the shifts in society, but I think that's absolutely another part of the story. And that moment does seem really like a pivotal moment for a certain set of realizations, I think, among ordinary people in Iran.
Yeah, definitely.
Golnar, we've reached the end of our time, which means I need to ask you the final question I ask every guest on the show, which is, when did you realize that sanctions were changing the world?
I remember, actually, probably when I did realize, it was quite a long time ago. I remember the oil for food program imposed on Iraq when Saddam Hussein was still in charge of the country. And I definitely, I think, got a sense, although I was a child at the time, I definitely got a sense that, decisions made in the US, economic decisions, can really impact the lives of people far away. Yeah.
Well, I think that that strong sense is clear in your reporting, and it's reporting that I benefited from immensely, both when you were in Tehran and also now reporting from London. So, Golnar, thank you for a fascinating discussion. We covered a lot of ground. There's a lot more I think we could talk about, but I think we'll have to leave it there for today.
Thank you very much.
I'm Esfander Batmangelic, and this has been The Sanctions Age. Our show is produced by Spiritland Productions. Thanks for listening.